Hello everyone, I'm Asha Nayaswami and we're continuing the essence of the Bhagavad Gita explained by Paramhansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. It's such a beautiful title, I like to say it every week. We are still in the chapter called The Nature of Right Action, and I think we're going to be hanging out in right action for a little while longer, so just settle in. We are on chapter 2, stanza 48, of the Bhagavad Gita. Swami's chapters don't match the chapters of the Gita, so just so you can get that straight. Okay, number 248 of the Bhagavad Gita. O Dhananjaya, which is another name for Arjuna. I have to say, I have always loved the name Dhananjaya. Something about that sounds so beautiful to me. O Dhananjaya, immerse yourself in the thought of yoga, union with God, and inwardly non-attached and even-minded, in both success and failure. Perfect evenness of mind and feeling. Perfect evenness of mind and feeling is itself the definition of yoga. Emphasizing again Dhananjaya and the name Arjuna reminds me of the setting where this whole thing is taking place. Of course, when you're dealing with the lives of these great souls, the lila, the divine play of how their life works out is, it's a very complicated question as to actually what really goes on when an avatar and his self-realized disciple are playing out a whole incarnation. I've been reading, as I believe I mentioned the last time I gave a webinar, a very interesting book about Sri Ramakrishna by his disciple Swami Saradananda, who spends an enormous amount of time in this 1,000-page, 2-volume book, the life of the great master Sri Ramakrishna, or Lila Prasanga Sri Ramakrishna they call it. And it's a very good book, which is why I mention it. But endlessly he tries to talk to us about this extraordinary combination of tremendous realization and perfect humanity. And Ramakrishna was such an unusual character in so many ways. It's not the point of the discussion, but he's a perfect one for someone to try to talk about this with, because he would go through, Ramakrishna would go through all these different stages of consciousness just many times during a day. And depending on where he was in that expanded cycle, his entire way of relating and presenting himself to the world would shift. And things that were possible at one state of consciousness were simply impossible at another. In Master's life, Swamiji often talked about, paradoxes in that awareness. In conversations with Yogananda, Master himself, I believe it's number 99. Last time I was here, I pulled it off the shelf, but I don't see it. I believe it's number 99, in which Master talks about how complicated it is to be who he is, because on one level he knows everything, on another level he doesn't. It's just, now that didn't really represent it very clearly, but it's just this strange mix of things. So what we have going on in this right now in the Gita, which is what made me think of this, remember, after a tremendous effort to avoid a war, Arjuna and his brothers have had to go to war with their own cousins for final possession of the kingdom. Now this is allegorical. Arjuna and his brothers represent the spiritual side of our own nature. His cousins represent the materialistic, Maya-held side of our nature. And the field of Kurukshetra is our own consciousness, but it also happened in this way. So Krishna is driving Arjuna's chariot after this tremendous effort to stop the war. They're on the eve of the war, to avoid the war. They're on the eve of the war. Krishna drives Arjuna between the two armies. Arjuna looks at his cousins, which is another dimension of himself, that's why they're cousins, and says to Krishna, I don't want to do this. And then the whole Bhagavad Gita is Krishna trying to explain to Arjuna, successfully, as it were, why he has to. So when he says to Arjuna, O Dhananjaya, immerse yourself in the thought of union with God, and then inwardly non-attached and even-minded to both success and failure. And so he's trying to explain to Arjuna, especially this chapter, which is called Secrets, the Nature of Right Action, how we can participate in this war and how it can still be okay. So what he's also explaining is how we can participate in this war, which is the life that we're living, in which half our nature tries to enmesh us in Maya, and one part of our nature, and another part of our nature wishes to extricate ourselves from this endless sort of sea of experiences. It's very complicated. So he uses different words here, and I sort of wanted to sort of say them, sort of what they mean. One of the words he uses in this chapter is the simple word even-minded. And I remember I've been following this path for a number of years, but I think it's a gift that God has given me, that I have a fairly vivid impression of myself at many stages along this journey. I feel that I have, I won't use the word pride, but I will say it pleases me to see that from where I started to where I am, I've actually changed. I've actually moved in the way that I hoped that I would when I started. I mean, that sounds a little complicated, but where I stand in relation to the infinite, who knows? That's really his problem, not mine. But I'm definitely inching in the right direction. That's what I can see. And this word even-mindedness, because I started actually on the spiritual path a couple of years before I met Swami Kriyananda. I met Swami Kriyananda in 1969, and it would have been probably 1966, so it would have been 3 years earlier. I actually started with Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, which is why I still have a strong heart tie. Ramakrishna was a word I learned much later was called Upaguru. Upaguru is a true master, but someone who takes you a certain distance until you find your forever path. And so Ramakrishna was my Upaguru. He took care of me until I got myself organized enough to be able to meet Swami Kriyananda and to be able to be ready when I met him and could move in what I've done ever since. But I remember that word even-mindedness because my first 3 years on the path, especially before I met Swami, were more intellectual. They got more balanced after I got to Ananda and got involved with Swamiji, but they were intellectual. So I had a lot of ideas. And here's this idea, even-mindedness. It was so far away. I was 19 or 20 at that point, and I'm still excitable. If I could remember the details of my horoscope, I would explain to you why. I think it has something to do with Mars or something like that, but I'm excitable. Less so than I used to be, but certain personality traits never go away. But I was real excitable at that period of time. And even the very idea of even-mindedness was incomprehensible to my excitable mind. I just didn't know where to put it. And what we always think about, what one is inclined to think about when you think of even-minded is one always thinks that everything is dulled down. And I don't know why that is, but that's just how we hear it. We hear it, even-minded, and we think everything is dulled down. And it takes a long time to realize that everything is not dulled down. It's raised up to the point where it's not like we're unconscious of the turbulent waves of life or even our own feelings. It's that we have expanded our concept of self to such an extent that there is a bigger container in which those turbulent waves can take place. If we're only on the waves, which is certainly where I was, and on occasion can still be, and all you do is you just ride them, You don't even know that there's an alternative to that. And it's beyond imagination of expectancy, to use Master's phrase about samadhi in a completely different way, but it really does apply. We really do not know how to imagine what it would feel like to be able to not hold back from this world at all, but nonetheless have an unchanging point, a reference point that doesn't get rattled by everything that happens. I was thinking about something recently, about a person I know who experienced a great disappointment in their life. And that disappointment came through someone that they had opened their heart to, like a child. How you just love completely, the way a child is so open. Well, this person was very childlike in their trust, like this. And then there was an unfortunate thing that happened to them. And it was made all the worse because the only way I could say is there was no protection, Now, almost everyone experiences in their lifetimes some kind of deep disappointment. Sometimes we experience many deep disappointments, whatever it might be. Losing a mother when you're a young child, or having someone turn to be an alcoholic on you and their personality shifts, or someone losing their mental balance either by an accident or by age, something like that. So we're completely vulnerable, and then our vulnerability is disrespected by the universe. And the absolute natural response is to shield yourself. And that's how pretty much everybody on this planet lives. We shield ourselves. We just can't bear it. Now, I spent a great deal of my life in very close association with Swami Kriyananda from 1986 on until his passing in 2013. I no longer lived in the same community he did. So whereas I saw him almost every day for the first 15 or 16 years, after that I saw him intermittently. But I was in very close contact with him, and I saw him often. Sometimes months would pass before we were in the same place, but with emails and telephone, I was always in touch with him. So I watched his life very carefully for a very long time. And as I began to understand his consciousness, and I have had to meditate on this a great deal, because to understand his consciousness, well, is impossible. But as I came to understand it more, he would say this often, and I watched it so many times, he was unafraid. That's really a simple word to say. He was just unafraid. There was nothing in life that he was anxious for it not to happen, personally. Now, what I say by that is he was very strong-minded about the direction of Master's work, about the development of Ananda, about the books he wrote, about his music. It wasn't that he was without force and preference, but he didn't need to shield himself because he wasn't afraid of being hurt. If he was hurt, he was hurt, and if he wasn't, he wasn't. But even toward the end of his life, I remember him often telling us this dream where he said he dreamt that he was going to be burned at the stake. And it was unfortunate, but it was going to happen. And in the dream, he just thought, well, it'll be painful for a while, but it won't last long, and then it'll be over. And then he said, and he was tied up at the stake, and the fuel was put around him, and I believe they started to light it. And he said, in the way of dreams, he said the people who were executing him were sort of having a dinner party over here. So he's being burned at the stake on one side, and they're having a dinner party on the other side. But then just at the last minute, just before the flames really took him over, his friends came in and rescued him. And he repeated the dream, partly because it was entertaining, But he also repeated the dream for this interesting reason. He said he was completely even-minded through the whole experience. He's going to be burned at the stake. He's being rescued. And as he put it, he said he was very pleased by the fact that neither eventuality caused a ripple in his consciousness. Now, isn't that remarkable? Now, the part I want to put into it is that I've never known anyone who experienced life, who was more aware, who moved through life with greater awareness than Swami Kriyananda. So that even-mindedness was not the result of not observing, not feeling, not noticing, keeping his eyes down, keeping his shoulders hunched, all the things that people do in order to keep that shield up. As he grew older, his physique changed, some of his vertebrae and so on began to collapse a little bit. But until that happened, he had this most interesting posture, which is he had the strung bow posture. He had the very straight spine and a slightly curved chest. And from the side, the heart moved first. Now, just even physically, if you try to think about, quite apart from the emotion, the spirit, and everything else, but just that willingness to come out like that and be able to dream about being burned at the stake and being rescued and not having either one of them upset your equanimity. And it comes to that word then, the other word he uses in this stanza, which is non-attached. And non-attached is another one of those sort of seminal spiritual words that are so hard to understand. When I was in my 20s with Swamiji, it's so amusing. Let me just think about this. We all make such good sense to ourselves. It's like everybody does what seems natural, and yet we all do such different things. And of course, youth, exuberance, all kinds of things. You just, inexperience, just not having a bigger perspective on life, you do all kinds of things. And Swamiji always made me feel comfortable to express my mind. And I was inclined to do it anyway, and he made me feel comfortable doing it. And he solicited my opinion. It took me many years to realize he didn't need it. He just solicited it because it helped me. But he did it so skillfully, I didn't realize how little he needed it for decades. Anyway, but as a result, I was allowed to put in front of him pretty much any fool thing that was in my mind and weigh it against his wisdom. And really, thank you God, I had a lot of training where I got, and it was part of, sometimes I stupidly fought for my ideas, but much of the time I presented them to see whether they had any validity. And we would discuss and I would discover, and then that way I learned. But I remember taking issue with the word non-attachment with Swami, and I also remember strongly taking issue with the word impersonal. And Swami had this wonderful way. It wasn't until I got a little calmer myself that I was able to observe it. He rarely would contradict, but if he didn't agree, and he didn't think you were capable or open to hearing an alternative, he would just kind of let what you say sit there. And then when enough time had passed, he would go on as if you hadn't spoken. Or he would, I would make a suggestion and then I would observe that it had been totally ignored. Not rejected, but just gone on as if it had never been offered. And of course, when I was listening, I noticed. But non-attachment was one of those words because I just couldn't understand how to do it. And thank God Swami understood that if he just kept saying it, then gradually I and others would come to understand it. He had this wonderful way of never bringing the top of the mountain down. He would walk down the mountain and try to coax you up, but he would never lower it just to make you feel better. So even-mindedness and non-attachment, here it is, it's right here in the Gita. They are fundamental to the spiritual path, and even if we don't get it, that's the pulse. It's like learning how to sing and learning, which I don't sing very well, and learning how to have exact pitch. You just have to keep hearing what the pitch is until you get it so deep in yourself that you can spontaneously mold your voice to it. So non-attachment is one of those things also. See, where the confusion comes in, just like we think even-mindedness means to bring everything down to the point where nothing bothers me, we think that non-attachment means to hold ourselves back. But to hold yourself back is to be uncommitted. And it's extremely easy to be non-attached if you don't care. To be non-attached because you don't care is completely different. You haven't even started at that point. Think about what I was saying earlier about being completely unafraid. It's if you're not committed, then you put out no energy. You just don't care. You don't put out energy to people. You don't put out energy to creative projects. You just don't care. And then you're right. You don't get as shaken up. That's a fact. But nor have you broken out of tamas, nor have you removed those layers of fear, nor have you begun to be whom God intended you to be. So again, the secret, the key here, the reality of it is, the key to meaning of this is that you have to be totally committed. But, I'll put it like this, what you're committed to, there's a wonderful, I saw many years ago, this documentary of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I saw it decades ago, so I don't know how many films have been made of her since. But there was this one conversation where she's sitting there and there's some journalist and, she devoted her life to helping the poor, but she was just a poor nun herself, and she had a few dozen, maybe a few hundred by the end, monks and nuns helping her, and she was in this, in Calcutta, which is like really, really a tiny drop into a very big sea of trying to help the poorest of the poor, which is who she served. So this journalist, in a kind of sassy way, was talking about how many people she actually pulls off the street and brings into her house of dying, and, compared to what certain other NGOs are able to do. And we're just kind of asking her, about her efficiency rate. And I remember, in her way, I actually met this woman several times because we used to go to India and we would visit her house, her monastery. She was a very no-nonsense woman. There wasn't a lot of fluff in her. She was straight. So she looks at this journalist in this way and says, "I'm not helping the poor. I'm doing what Jesus asked me to do." She didn't explain it, just stated it like that. Her life story is that she was a nun in a convent, and she, I believe, was a school teacher, and she was on the train somewhere in India going from one of her convent houses to the other, and Jesus spoke to her. And I believe he said, "Serve the poor." It was something that caused her in that moment to just redirect her life in the way it went. So when she said that to him, she's telling him, you think I'm serving the poor. I'm not. I'm doing what Jesus told me to do. Now you can see that is a universe of difference. He was really concerned about how many poor she was serving. And of course she was too, because Jesus told her to serve the poor. And if she was going to serve the poor, she was going to do a good job of it. Because if Jesus asks you to do something, you kind of want to do it the best you can. You can kind of see how there would be an incentive to do that. But she was never serving the poor. She was doing what Jesus asked her to do. And it was perfectly clear that if he asked her to walk away and never look back, she would have done that just as easily. Now, that's where our even-mindedness comes from, and that's what non-attachment is. We are deeply attached to following God's guidance as clearly as we are able to. And then once that guidance is given, once that guidance is understood, even the first steps of that guidance, we give everything we can to it. Why would we not? If God asks something of you, which, whether or not you hear his voice, look around at your life. It's probably the life God gave you, because what do you know? There it is. I mean, where else do we think it came from? So even if we don't have a clear sort of list of things that he expects us to do, we start right where we're standing on the assumption that if this is my karmic position, then the divine must have had a hand in it. But the commitment is to do what God asked us to do. Or if we can't put it in those terms, to do dharma, to follow righteousness. And dharma in this sense means also that which leads to expanded consciousness. So what we need to do in order to be even-minded and non-attached, which is what he's suggesting to us here, is that we have to focus ourselves on something that doesn't oscillate, that isn't in itself causing us to react, because everything else we do, it's going to be good one day and bad one day and good one day and bad one day and good one day and bad one day. When Swami Kriyananda was writing The Path, which was now, he wrote it in 1976, he finished it in 77. These are, for me this is yesterday, but if I look at a calendar, these are actually quite a long time ago, years. I mean, in the course of one lifetime, which is much shorter than I thought it would be, now that I'm at this end of it. It was a while ago when he wrote that book. But anyway, when he wrote that book, it was the first major book he wrote. Subsequently, he wrote many others, including this one. But it was the first major book he wrote. He'd written a few small ones. Crises in Modern Thought was pretty significant. But most of the other books were small, good, but small. Your Sun Sign is a Spiritual Guide, Visit to Saints of India, Eastern Thoughts, Western Thoughts. There were probably a few others. And that book was of tremendous importance to him. He really felt once he finished that book, it didn't matter to him whether he ever did anything else. Of course, if you look from 77 to his passing in 2013, a lot happened. But as a young monk, his guru, master, had said to him, write down my words, I want you to write about me. So here's, Swami met Master when Swami was 22. And there he was. He only had 3.5 years before Master left his body. But here's his guru, Master, telling him, you're going to write this book. You have to write this book about me. So it was always in Swami's consciousness, always. And he was making himself ready. He started writing it about 1972, I think. But he said the words were, he didn't feel he was ready. And then 2 years later, he started again in 74. So he also had the sense that it was tremendously important because Master was, there was nothing written about him. And no disciple had written about him at that point. I paused for a moment. No, I don't think Kamala Silva had written her book at that point. Maybe she had, but I don't remember. The Flawless Mirror. But no, there had been nothing like what Swami was writing. So the responsibility was enormous on him. Now, where am I going in all this? Oh, yes. But at a certain point, he told me later, he said, I felt Master's blessing on it, and then he said, then that feeling went away. And he said, and for several months, I didn't have that feeling, but I just had to persevere on faith. And I thought about that for a long time. My goodness, he said, that's how God does it sometimes. He said, it's easy. This is the lest ye see signs and wonders you will not believe. Of course it's easy to just sail along doing God's will as long as he's sitting on your shoulder saying, attaboy, you got it right. But what happens when there are no signs and wonders? and you're just thrown back on common sense, endurance, courage, confidence in your own experience, that nothing has changed, and even if the feeling is gone, I'll just keep going. Very, very interesting. Even-minded, non-attached. What am I attached to? And Swami said, there was no question of his turning back at that point. He said he just went on, and eventually the feeling returned. But we have to set ourselves. I remember I was in a circumstance once. It was when I still lived in Ananda village, and I was living in, I lived in fairly simple circumstances for a long time. And I was living in one of the small trailers that I lived in. I had actually managed to maneuver myself into a slightly larger trailer at somebody else's expense, something I have long regretted. But anyway, I managed to commandeer it for myself. But even still, it was primitive and not pretty. It wasn't attractive. There was nothing aesthetic about it. And I remember sitting there in that trailer, realizing on some deep level that it wasn't good for me to live like this anymore. I've been living that way for 8 or 9 years. And prior to that, I loved living that way. It just seemed perfect to me. But this thought crossed my mind that this isn't the right place for you anymore. But I had, no money. And I had no money, not because I was not capable of earning it. I was perfectly capable of earning it. I wasn't earning it because I wanted to be at Ananda and I wanted to build Ananda. And making money and building Ananda were not the same thing at that point at all. So the only possible way I could have followed that was to betray a higher dharma. So it was a very interesting moment for me because I felt it was a true intuition, but that true intuition conflicted with a higher dharma. And I remember just sort of saying to God and Guru, I didn't know who was talking to me, well, if you really want this to happen, you're going to have to do something about it because there's nothing I can do. This is the non-attachment. This is the commitment to Dharma as I understand it. And then let it be. And a year later, my entire life situation was completely different. I was living in a lovely place with colors and light and little prisms in the window and it made rainbows on the walls, And I had not really remembered in between. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, there was a moment, wasn't there? Where God said, this is what you need. And I said, well, it's your problem, not mine. And what we need to be relaxed in our lives is to hook ourselves in a way that cannot be undone to the eternal thread. And then, when it does what it's going to do, even if it tosses us about like a rag doll in a rough sea, our single attachment remains. I will do what God wants me to do. I remember when I was facing a particularly hard test once. Someone, it was like, it appeared that I had a choice. And someone said, well, you don't need to do this, if it's so upsetting to you. And then I remember, I think I cursed a little bit, which I won't now. I said a few choice words because I couldn't express myself in more gracious English. And I said, no, the blankety blank problem here is that I know I have to do it. If I thought I had a choice, I wouldn't be so intense about it. But the truth is, the only thing I'm attached to is doing my Dharma. I may suffer in small ways, but it's not worth it. It's just not worth it to give it up. So then, even all of this, it never fully detaches you. The wonderful thing about true scripture is that it has a very high dimension. From Well, it has an infinite dimension. Let's not mince words. It's infinite in its potential. But because it's true, it can be dragged all the way to here. So he says, perfect evenness of mind and feeling is itself the definition of yoga, which yoga, before he says, union with God. So perfect even-mindedness, is union with God. But even to solve your problems in the direction of God, which is the wonderful acronym Haridas made on, he called it SPIDOG, solving problems in direction of God. If you practice SPIDOG and move in the right direction, you do your best. So in certainly my own life experience, my unwavering commitment to Master, to Swami Kriyananda, to serving through Ananda, has meant that no matter how many other things happen, I've never really been at sea, because that's always there. And it's the point against which everything else can be measured. I've lost this, I've lost that, I'm disappointed here, I'm suffering because of this, I'm being burned at the stake. All of these things can happen. But there is a level that I will call even-mindedness, which is that essential link is still there. Now, of course, I feel extraordinarily fortunate, and I thank God every day that so far in my life, that link has held. If that link is not yet forged, because it can't be assumed that it is for everyone, that's what you need to work on. That's what a person needs to work on. And it's building your faith in God, and if you are a disciple, building your faith in your guru. And you build your faith. Faith is built by paying attention, is actually the only way I can think about it. I had this experience, this was a long time ago. It was about 1979, could have been into 1980, but I believe it was the summer of 79. Swami Kriyananda was living, he went from Ananda Village to San Francisco for the summer. And it was when we had this place we called the Nanda House, which was this big 5-story house in Pacific Heights in San Francisco. We had that house for a decade, and it was just starting that summer. And Swami came down from Ananda Village, south from Ananda Village, to live in San Francisco for 2 or 3 months. And I had volunteered to be part of that project, which was not a smart idea because I really wasn't destined to be part of that project, and I inserted myself into it. So Swamiji sort of kept me out of the project one way or another, because it wasn't really mine to do until I figured that out and we came back to the village. But in any case, part of that was he got recording equipment and he was recording. And I was his recording engineer, which tells you he didn't have a lot of good choices. So I was his recording engineer, and he made this beautiful chanting tape, fantastic chanting tape. I don't know if it still exists. It was called Music for Meditation. And he would teach classes, and then he would go to his apartment. I would go with him, and then late at night we would do some recording. And one of those late nights we were there, and I set up that recording. It was just like a 2-track or 4-track probably recording to a machine on tape. And I set it up the way I always set it up, and I could not get the sound that went into the microphone to appear on the tape. I couldn't get it to appear on the tape. So Swami comes in, are we ready? No, sir, not quite. Well, I guess I'll go meditate for a while. Yes, that would be a good idea. He comes back out. He said, well, how are we doing now? No, sir, I can't get it in. It just went on like this. And finally, I was just beside myself. I couldn't figure it out. And I suddenly said, Divine Mother, if you want us to record tonight, you're going to have to help. And then I disconnected every single plug, everything. and reconnected it exactly the same way. Worked perfectly. But the thing was, it took me a long time to ask. The next night, Swamiji was giving a class. Then when, he came out and we recorded, and he said, "What did you do?" I said, "I asked Divine Mother to help me." I sort of was a little chagrined like this. And so the next night he was giving a class and he called me up on the stage. He said, "Asha has a story she wants to tell." And I walked up and, I trusted him. I walked up and I said, "Oh, what is it?" I didn't even know. He said, "What happened last night?" So I told the whole story and I said, Divine Mother will help you. And then the punchline is, of course, if you remember to ask. And it's surprising, like you would think, of course I'll remember to ask. It's just like you would think, of course I'll remember to ask. But we don't. And if we want to develop faith, if we want to develop a relationship, if we want to become attached to the right things so we can become non-attached, unattached, was that the word, non-attached to the wrong things, we have to build it. If you're married to someone and you never talk to them, and you never have a relationship, and you never open your heart, not a lot good happens. If your child never talks to you or won't talk to you, you have to participate. God has an annoying respect for our free will, is the only thing I can say. He just, if that's how you want to play it, he lets you play it that way. So we have to constantly build that relationship, because if we give to it, it gives back to us. It's really as simple as that. I remember watching Swamiji once. He'd been in seclusion for a while. He was still in silence. This was when he didn't have a cook or a housekeeper. I'm going like this because he was making a chapati. He was making a chapati like this. And he was just silent. I was just sitting there. I was watching him. It was in what is now the Crystal Hermitage, but the kitchen was all in the same room. It was like a different world in there. I was sitting in the living room and he was just making this chapati. And there was he wasn't alone. And I don't mean that I was in the room. There was such a powerful sense of relationship emanating from him. And I thought to myself, wow. Because he isn't alone. He doesn't feel alone. He feels this communion is actually the word. He's in a state of communion. So when we're in a state of communion, we're in grace, we're protected. And then even-mindedness, perfect even-mindedness, evenness of mind and feeling, he adds, is itself the definition of yoga. Isn't that lovely? So, I'm going to read one more now, or two more, because there's several together here. So, number 249. Action performed with desire for the fruits is greatly inferior to action guided by wisdom. Therefore, O Dhananjaya, seek in everything to be guided by wisdom. Misery attends actions performed for their fruits. Oh, I love that word. Misery. He doesn't even say unpleasant. It won't be as nice. It's not quite as much fun. He says misery. There's a strange line in the sand spiritually, which a lot of us have had to cross over, and it's not a lot of fun to cross over. And I remember, again, these are one of these things that I remember always watching in Swamiji. Swamiji was totally cheerful. He was so funny. He was so fun. It was always such a delight, with very few exceptions. At times, something would weigh on him. And there would be times where he would be more withdrawn, more grave is actually the word that I think I would use, just more grave. But as a rule, he was so funny and so cheerful and just so witty, and we just had so much fun together. I remember once we whenever a witticism would start with not just him, but there was a crowd of us, Jyotish and Devi and others who were inclined this way, it would always be, you just try to top each other. We'd never leave anything. It was always just like this. And I remember once I said to him, "So you're making fun of me?" And he got very thoughtful like that. I thought, oh dear. He said, "No," he said, "I'm not actually making fun of you. I'm taking advantage of the fun which is already there." He said like that. But in any case, at the same time, that he could be so lighthearted, as a way of being, as a continuous way of being, not like occasionally being in a good mood, but just as a continuous way of being. He was so light in his heart. He had such a disinclination for this world. I mean, just like on a level that used to frighten me. And I recognize now why it frightened me, because I was still hoping that I could kind of make it work and I could have both. Mm-hmm. Then this is like way, way deep. This isn't like I was glib, I could say it. I could really say it. But underneath all those words, I was kind of hoping that I would just have a cheerful, happy life, that I could have everything I wanted, and I could also be real, real spiritual. And it was just all going to kind of happen together. And Swami was always not willing to support that particular fantasy. No, he wasn't. But he wasn't dark. And it was so confusing to me how he could call it so clear and use words so strong, like the word misery, which is really a great word, misery, and not be cynical or sad. So he says it right here. Misery attends actions performed for their fruits. It's not. So actions performed for their fruits are just like, wanting the positive result from all my good energy. And it doesn't mean that you don't enjoy the positive result of your good energy, but you're even-minded and detached. So when instead of that, you get burned at the stake, like, all right. And what's also interesting is that we think misery comes when we don't get what we want. That's our definition of misery. I had it all worked out, and this was going to happen, and this didn't happen, and now I feel just miserable. But what Krishna is saying to us is the misery is because we had it all worked out. And this is how complicated it gets again, because we have to be committed and try to make it work out. I remember when we were trying to get it together to have the community, to get a church, I think this is what it was. Let me think which one it was, it doesn't matter, but to get the community together or to get the church that we now enjoy there. And we were asking Swamiji sort of how to pray about it. And he said, don't bother asking if it's a good thing. He said, self-evidently it's a good thing. Of course God would want us to bring to fruition these fundamental aspects of his path. So we don't just keep saying every day, do you want it? Do you want it today? Do you want it today? Do you want it today? It's like we commit ourselves, absolutely. And of course, what we're asking every day is, inspire me, make me your instrument. It's not like we pick up the ball and just run with it without ever thinking about it again. We're not acting for ourselves. And the way it all ends up working out is beyond imagination of expectancy. The way it works out is we become the flow of energy. And we become the divine flow of energy. And what we are, it's not even what we're attached to. It's just simply what we are, is the divine flow of energy. I was reading about Ramakrishna, and it reminded me of some stories I've seen about, a particular story about Master, about how, the ordinary human being, even advanced souls, but certainly ordinary human beings, carry forward from all of our incarnations all these impressions in our mind. So we're always thinking about that and thinking about this and desiring this and wondering about that, and many different impulses come to us, and some of them seem like a really good idea. Swamiji said to me once, and it was just such a simple statement, but unfortunately extremely true. He said, you have very good intuition and you're also emotional and you can't always tell the difference. I said, yeah, that is the problem, because a lot of them are intuitive, but I can't always tell the difference because I have a lot of impressions in my mind. So then talking about Ramakrishna, because he had no impressions in his mind, he'd overcome it all. And really that's how I experienced Swami Kriyananda too, and he explained certain things to me that confirm that. He just, there were no vrittis. There are no vrittis. So if there's no vrittis, there's no karmic impressions being imposed on a situation. The only thing that's coming through is the flow of the divine. So Ramakrishna would have, any impulse that came through his mind, he would immediately follow, because no impulse came through his mind that wasn't sent to him by Divine Mother, by Mother as he understood, the Divine Mother is how he was devoted to God. And he just trusted completely that if it came into his mind, it was from her, because there was no other source. And I was remembering that story of Master. I believe Swami has it in the Path, where Master stopped. When he used to drive in a certain area of Southern California, there was a little shop where they sold shortbread. And so they were driving there, and he wanted to stop and get some shortbread. And he sent one of the nuns who was with him to get the shortbread, and she came out and she said, "I'm sorry, sir, there isn't any." And he said, "Why, Mother?" Like that, to Divine Mother. And as Swami explains it, it wasn't that he was unhappy because it wasn't there. He was just perplexed. Why would you have brought me here to get shortbread if there wasn't shortbread? Because no impressions would go through his mind except what she sent him. And just at that moment, the woman comes running out from the shop with a package of shortbread and said, "I was saving this for another customer, but I can make more before he gets here." Ah, yes, of course. That's why Divine Mother sent me here. So, let me think what I was saying here. Oh, so what happens to us is, because we have all these conflicting impressions, we want things to come out a certain way. And the misery is created because all those conflicting impressions. It's like, as long as we are thinking about what we're going to get, and it's a question of attachment and even-mindedness and all of these other things, but it even goes even more fundamental than that. As long as there is a self there, a separate egoic self there that's trying to get for itself, that's the misery-making factor, you see. I recall, it's very interesting when you think about things. For a long time my life has been pretty steady in one direction, but when I was very young, my childhood and up until my late teens, 19, when I found the path of self-realization, I was compelled. I didn't know how to put it. I called it a desire for happiness. In retrospect, I was searching for truth. I was accepted at Stanford University, and so I went. And in the first 2 weeks, I realized, I don't think I had the words for it, but I realized I was looking for wisdom, and all they had was knowledge. And I realized later, as I say, I don't know how clearly I had those words, but I realized that they were just talking. They didn't know how to avoid misery. I put it, they didn't know how to be happy. But happiness to me was what the point was, and what would all this knowledge do for you if that knowledge wasn't leading you to happiness. And of course, they didn't know. So all they had to share was knowledge. They were fine people, but they didn't know. And I wanted something completely else. So what I'm saying is, when I look back, I realized that the impulse from my earliest memory was always the same. But it wasn't until I met Swamiji and really understood what that was and found the vocabulary for it and all of that. But then I could look back and I could see I've always been the same. And when I was able to articulate what troubled me in my early teens, because I had this passionate need to be happy, and I wasn't at all not happy. And there was nothing wrong. My life was great. I had wonderful family. I mean, everything was great. But there was still this sense of lurking misery, which didn't make any sense at all. And finally, even when I said it to Swami later, I said, "What was that?" And he just said so simply, "Past life memories." Oh yeah, of course. I remembered all the attachment to the fruits of my actions and all the misery it had caused. But this is what I wanted to say. When I finally understood God realization, ego transcendence, I realized that what had made me so miserable is I felt so confined. And what I was confined by was my identification with my limited egoic self. I mean, those words wouldn't have meant anything to me, but that was the feeling. I felt like there was always this edge. And as long as I was inside that container, I was always going to be vulnerable. And so the ultimate freedom, even-mindedness, non-attachment, union with God, is when that sense of self, when you break out of that sense of self. And then Krishna is telling us step by step how to do it. And since we're all active beings and we're in this world in which action is required, attachment to the fruits of our actions reinforces that belief that I am a separate entity from the greater flow of reality, that certain conditions are required for this entity to experience what it wants to experience. And if I get those, I feel good. I've assuaged my suffering for the moment, but then I have to be anxious lest they change again. And unless and until I just become the flow of energy and realize that whatever God sends me, I'm just the flow of energy, and the flow of I'm immortal, I'm infinite, and I am part of the greater whole, and the greater whole moves by the will of God. I'm always going to be a little subject to misery, and misery is not a small thing. So what I saw in Swamiji all that time is he just understood how it worked. He just said, everybody's an ego somewhere on the spectrum. He said that once. He said even animals, they're just at a lower point on the spectrum, and everybody's just on that spectrum between ego and infinity. And as long as you're anywhere on that spectrum, you're going to be attached, you're going to be thinking about the results, and misery is inevitable. And it's not at all an unhappy thing, because it's a delusion. And that's why Swami could just look at the delusion, call it what it was, but the reality is bliss. And compared to once when he was very unwell, I said, "Swamiji, how are you feeling?" "Oh, not well," he said, "not at all well. But compared to an eternity of bliss," he said, "I'm fine," just like that. Isn't that wonderful? God bless you.